Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a solo drive through the countryside. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by trees that were shedding their leaves, casting long, eerie shadows under the fading sunlight. I always enjoyed these quiet drives, just me and the open road, away from the noise of the city. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The road wound through rolling hills, with fields stretching far beyond the horizon. I passed a few dilapidated barns, their broken windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped, silent, isolated, and forgotten. As I drove, the familiar sound of my tires crunching over the gravel faded, replaced by a strange, distant echo, almost like footsteps following behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone. But there was no one. Just empty road stretching out behind me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just my imagination. But as I drove further, the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Eventually, I reached an old, overgrown trail leading into the woods. I couldn't help but take a detour, curious about the trees that loomed ahead. The leaves crunched beneath my tires as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air became cooler and the sounds of nature seemed to fade, leaving only silence. The trees stretched high above, their branches forming a dense canopy, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. It felt as if I had stepped into a different world, one untouched by time. I stopped the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cool air. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The wind whispered through the trees, but there were no birdsong, no rustling of animals, just the stillness of the woods. I wandered off the trail, following a narrow footpath that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted limbs casting dark shapes on the ground. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant or echoing. They were close, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind me. But there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the panic rising in my throat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own shaky breathing. I clutched my phone tightly, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I must have been imagining things. It had to be the isolation, the eerie quiet of the woods. I told myself that over and over, but deep down, I knew better. I retraced my steps, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the path harder to see in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it was dead. My signal had vanished, and I realized just how far I'd strayed from the main road. Panic set in. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. I could feel them behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. Still, no one. I forced myself to walk faster, the crunching of leaves beneath my feet now sounding like whispers, like the trees themselves were speaking. The woods felt endless, as if they had no intention of letting me go. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto an old, faded trail marker. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the word path etched into the wood. I followed the marker, hoping it would lead me back to my car. The silence was deafening, but at least now I had a point of reference. I kept my head down, not wanting to look behind me, where I knew something, or someone, was watching. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my car waiting in the distance, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. I didn't stop running until I reached it, slamming the door shut behind me. As I drove away, the weight in my chest eased, but the feeling of being followed didn't. I knew I'd be looking over my shoulder for a long time. What had been out there in the woods with me? I still don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. It was a scorching summer day when I decided to go for a drive. I'd always loved the open road. There was something freeing about it, something that made me feel alive. That's what I told myself, at least, as I packed some snacks and set off, not really knowing where I was headed. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the cracked, dusty roads. I didn't care about the destination, just the journey. Hours passed as I cruised through deserted country roads, the only sound being the low hum of my car and the occasional rustling of wind through the tall grass. As the sun began to set, I found myself driving past an old, long-forgotten cemetery. It was small, nestled between rolling hills and forgotten farmland, surrounded by a thick, weathered iron fence. The gate was hanging open, creaking slightly in the breeze. Something about it drew me in, though I wasn't sure why. I decided to stop, telling myself I was just curious. The cemetery was eerily silent, the headstones leaning at odd angles, barely readable beneath a thick layer of moss. I wandered through the rows of graves, each one worn and forgotten. The sunlight was fading fast, and I felt the oppressive quiet closing in around me. There was something wrong about this place. Not just the silence, but the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the light itself was bending around the graves. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old, crumbling mausoleum that the feeling of unease became too much to ignore. The door hung open, rusted and creaking as if inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the faint smell of decay lingering in my nostrils. The walls were lined with faded, crumbling inscriptions, each name barely legible. I moved deeper into the darkness, my flashlight casting shaky beams across the space. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I froze. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its shape was twisted, features distorted in the dim light. Hollow eyes stared blankly at me, and I could see cracks running through its skin, almost as if it were made of clay that had been left to crack and decay. Who's there? My voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed unnaturally through the mausoleum. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me. The oppressive silence grew thicker, and I took a hesitant step back. The flashlight flickered, casting shifting shadows that danced around the walls, making the figure look more monstrous with every movement. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those hollow, staring eyes. There was a low, grating sound, like gravel being dragged across stone, and suddenly the figure stepped closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I backed further into the shadows. My flashlight illuminated more of the room, revealing cracks in the floor, the walls, even in the ceiling above. It felt as though the very structure of the mausoleum was breaking apart. Then came the whisper, soft, barely audible, yet it seemed to echo in my head. You shouldn't be here. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, distorted, and came from all around me. I felt the weight of it pressing down on my chest as if the very air had grown heavier. My breath quickened and I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the door. But as I reached for it, I felt something cold and clammy brush against my arm. I spun around, the flashlight barely illuminating the space. The figure was right behind me now, closer than I had realized. It reached out, long, bony fingers extending, and I could see the cracks running across its skin, the same as the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It didn't need to speak again. I already knew it wasn't going to let me leave. I screamed, a sound that echoed off the cold, damp stone. But then, everything fell silent once more. When I woke, the sun was high in the sky, and the cemetery was silent as if nothing had ever happened. My car was parked where I'd left it, the gate still swinging gently in the breeze. But I didn't dare go back inside the mausoleum. I couldn't bring myself to. It was a summer evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood park. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown trails. I had lived in this town my entire life, but I had always avoided this park, partly because it had a reputation, mostly forgotten now, of being haunted or unsettling. People used to talk about strange noises, whispers, and figures moving through the trees, but I never paid much attention to those stories. That night, though, I needed some quiet, some space to clear my head. The park wasn't far from my home, just a short walk away. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the old oaks loomed over the trails and the air smelled thick with the scent of pine and earth. As I strolled down the main path, the woods on either side seemed darker than I remembered, the trees taller and more imposing. The usual sounds of the city were distant now, just the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of insects. The silence was unnerving, almost oppressive. I had a strange feeling, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for something. I continued walking, my footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. I passed by an old wooden bench, splintered and half-rotted, its paint chipped and faded. It had been there forever, the kind of thing no one really paid attention to anymore. But something about it caught my eye. A faint scratch, almost too faint to notice, ran down the bench's surface. The marks looked as if they'd been made by long, sharp claws. I paused for a moment, staring at the bench, my heart thudding harder. It couldn't have been anything natural. No animal could have left such clean, precise scratches. Maybe kids had vandalized it, but the deeper I looked, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as though those marks weren't meant to be there at all. I shook off the unease and kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I ventured further into the park, I noticed something strange. The trees weren't swaying with the breeze like they should have been. Instead, the branches hung motionless, as if the wind itself had vanished. Then came the sound. A low, raspy whisper carried by the stillness. It came from behind me, soft and indistinct, as though it had traveled from far away. I stopped, listening, but the whisper faded before I could make out any words. My stomach twisted into knots, and I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, as though I could outrun whatever had made that sound. As I turned a bend in the path, I saw something ahead, a figure, partially obscured by the thick trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silhouetted against the last light of the setting sun. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't look human. Its outline was too tall, too lanky, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Shadows seemed to crawl along its body, swallowing it whole. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I felt something stir inside me. A primal fear I couldn't explain. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift or move. It simply stood there, watching me. I forced myself to look away, to keep walking. But as I passed, I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. I clenched my fists, willing my legs to carry me faster. A rustling behind me snapped my attention back. I spun around, expecting to see nothing. But there it was again. The whisper, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't words, just fragments, like someone muttering in a language I didn't recognize. The figure was gone, but the trees seemed to bend toward me now, their branches brushing the path like fingers reaching out. The unease grew until it felt unbearable. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. Of course, there was nothing but static in this part of the park, and I had no way to call for help even if I wanted to. Suddenly, I heard the sound again, this time closer than I'd ever imagined. It was right behind me now, following, breathing down my neck. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the woods, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness that seemed to stretch forever. Who's there? I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer, just the whisper. Louder now, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent. The whisper, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. All of it disappeared. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking, every step trembling beneath me. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but I could have sworn something was still there, hidden just beyond the edge of my vision. The park finally gave way to the street, and as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. The whispers echoed in my ears, and I didn't dare look back. I've never gone back to the park. It was supposed to be a simple day, just a quiet walk through the neighborhood. I lived in a suburban area, nothing unusual about it. I liked to take long walks after work to clear my head, the kind of walks where you don't think much about anything, just put one foot in front of the other, lost in your own thoughts. But that day, something felt off from the very beginning. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over everything. The streets were empty, no kids playing, no cars passing by. It was eerily quiet, but I figured everyone must have been inside, waiting out the weather. I didn't think much of it, just kept walking, letting my mind wander. It wasn't until I passed the old abandoned house at the end of the street that the feeling of unease really sank in. The house had been empty for as long as I could remember. Worn-down shutters, a porch that creaked with every gust of wind. I always avoided it, always felt like something wasn't right about it. But this time, something about the atmosphere pulled me closer. I slowed my pace, staring at the house. It looked different, almost as if it had been watching me. The windows, once dark and empty, now seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement inside. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. As I took another step forward, I heard a sound, a soft whisper, too low to make out. My skin crawled. I stopped, trying to listen, but the world around me seemed unnaturally silent, almost as though the sound had been swallowed by the void. Then I saw it. A figure appeared in one of the upstairs windows, standing still. It was tall, obscured by the dim light, but there was something off about it. It wasn't a shadow. It felt more like a void, an absence of something rather than a presence. My breath caught as the figure tilted its head as if studying me. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called that, seemed to peer directly into my soul. Seconds felt like hours. Then the figure turned and disappeared from the window. My legs felt like stone as I finally managed to take a step back, my mind screaming at me to leave. I stumbled away, never taking my eyes off the house. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, truly watched. The emptiness that had once filled the neighborhood now felt suffocating, like the world had become a void of silence and shadows. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. The thought of that figure still haunted me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Something was there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going to forget me. I don't remember exactly when I noticed something strange. It wasn't a specific moment, more like a slow, creeping feeling that followed me for days. I was spending a week at my family's lake house, a place we've always gone to relax. Nothing special, just a quiet cabin on the edge of a still lake surrounded by forest. The first few days were peaceful, just me and my parents. We spent our time fishing, hiking, and reading. The lake was calm and the forest stretched endlessly around us. I figured it was just one of those perfect summer trips where nothing goes wrong. But then the dreams started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, my heart pounding. The dreams weren't anything like the usual ones. No monsters, no shadows lurking in the dark. It was more like silence. A deep, oppressive silence that felt too heavy to breathe in. The forest, the lake. It was all too quiet. I could hear my own breathing and nothing else. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no waves lapping at the shore. Just a complete void of sound. The third night, it happened again. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the quiet surroundings messing with my head. I got out of bed and stepped onto the small porch, hoping a breath of fresh air would clear my mind. But as soon as I stepped outside, I felt it. Something wasn't right. The lake, usually serene and reflective, had become unsettlingly still. I sat down on the porch, staring at the water, listening to the echo of my thoughts. Then I noticed something. The surface of the lake wasn't calm anymore. It had started to ripple. Not from any wind, but from something beneath it. At first, I thought maybe it was just a fish or some animal moving through the water, but the ripples weren't natural. They formed a pattern, slow and deliberate. A figure, faint and shadowy, began to emerge beneath the surface. I froze. The figure didn't resemble a person. It was long, distorted, its limbs unnaturally elongated, moving like it was struggling to pull itself from the depths. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow and dark, like the void beneath the water. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure seemed to glide toward me, its movements unnatural, like something from a dream, too wrong to be real. I could feel its gaze, even though it had no visible face. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't something human. Then it vanished. The water grew calm again. I blinked, not sure if what I had seen was real. The air felt heavy, and I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, I forced myself back inside, locking every door and window. The next morning, my parents woke me up as if nothing had happened. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. We went about our day, fishing, laughing, trying to forget about the quiet nights. But I knew deep down that something had changed. It's been years since that trip, but I still visit the lake house. The dreams haven't stopped, and sometimes in the stillness of the night, I wonder if I'll see that figure again, waiting beneath the surface, watching. I was on a road trip, solo, something I'd always wanted to do. Just me, my car, and the open road stretching ahead. I decided to take a scenic route, away from the highways, weaving through small forgotten towns. The goal was simple: get lost in the quiet and enjoy the freedom of being alone. By the time the sun started to set, I was deep in unfamiliar territory. The winding road was flanked by endless fields of tall grass that seemed to stretch forever. There was nothing around, just miles of isolation and silence. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool air fill the car, the only sounds being the soft hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. As the light faded, I found myself searching for a place to stop for the night. There was no sign of a town or motel for miles, just endless fields and a single, overgrown dirt path leading off to the side of the road. It wasn't much of a choice, but I decided to follow the path, hoping to find a clearing to park and rest. The path led me to a small, abandoned barn surrounded by broken-down fences. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. The place felt like it hadn't been touched in years, with weeds growing thick through the cracks in the wood. I parked near the entrance, killed the engine, and sat in the silence, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal, but the feeling of being watched was too distinct. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation didn't fade. I decided to explore the barn, curious about what might be inside. The door creaked open, revealing a musty, dark interior. I stepped cautiously, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered. What was once used to store hay and farm tools had become a hollow shell of rotting wood and forgotten belongings. I moved further into the barn, shining my flashlight around the dusty space. Old furniture covered in layers of grime, rusted tools scattered on the floor. There was nothing of interest, just reminders of what the place once was. I felt my unease growing, but my curiosity kept me going. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light. My breath hitched as I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there in the shadows, watching. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to step closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there it was. A human-shaped silhouette standing still as if trapped in the dark. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I took another step, and then another, my legs feeling heavy. With each movement, the figure seemed to draw closer, though it didn't advance itself. It was like we were inching toward each other slowly, relentlessly. When I was just a few feet away, I saw it. The face, or what I thought was a face. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me, void of any life or expression. The features were distorted, almost alien. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The barn creaked again, and then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. I stumbled backward, tripping over some debris and falling to the ground. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, trying to escape, but the figure moved faster than I could comprehend. I sprinted toward the exit, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. My legs felt like they were on fire as I burst through the barn door, gasping for air. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the figure far behind, lost in the darkness. I still don't know what I saw that night. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't supposed to be there. But I do know this: I'll never take another solo road trip into the unknown. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk in the old neighborhood park that bordered the edge of town. The park wasn't particularly large, but it had always felt familiar, almost like a second home growing up. The trees were tall and ancient, their twisted branches stretching across the paths, casting long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had been years since I last wandered through these trails, but I always felt drawn back whenever I needed space to think. As I walked deeper into the park, the air grew cooler, the rustling leaves crunching softly beneath my feet. There were hardly any other people around, which only added to the sense of solitude. I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone. The park was rarely crowded during the evening hours. I figured it would be a peaceful walk, perfect to clear my head after a long day. I passed a small, decrepit wooden bench half buried beneath overgrown vines. It was an old fixture from the days of my childhood. I paused for a moment, staring at the faded graffiti that had long since been swallowed by moss. The bench felt like a quiet witness to countless secrets from the past, memories of old friendships and whispered promises. As I continued along the trail, I noticed the faint sound of running water. A small creek weaved its way through the park, barely noticeable until now. The gentle babble of the stream was oddly calming, and I decided to follow its course. The path led me to a clearing, where the creek widened into a shallow pool surrounded by tall, leafy trees. The sunset painted the water in hues of amber and gold, reflecting the serene beauty of the surroundings. I sat down by the edge, my feet dipping into the cool, clear water. The sound of the water lapping against the rocks was soothing. I lost track of time, simply sitting there, letting my thoughts wander. The tension from earlier in the day seemed to melt away, replaced by an eerie stillness. There was no breeze, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural silence that seemed almost too quiet. Suddenly, from deep within the trees, I heard a whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind shifting through the leaves. But as I strained to listen, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. "I'm here." The words were barely more than a breath, carried by the faint breeze. My heart jolted. I glanced around, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, but the clearing remained empty. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. The park was known for its stillness, for its isolated atmosphere. Maybe it was just the wind, bending the branches and creating phantom sounds. Still, the voice echoed in my head. "I'm here. Please, stay." My pulse quickened and I stood up, backing away from the water's edge. The feeling of being watched returned, pressing down on me like a weight. I could feel something. Something was there, hidden just beyond the trees. I turned and began walking quickly toward the trail. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were moving closer. Each step I took sent chills down my spine. Then, just as I reached the edge of the trees, I felt it. A cold, bony hand grasping at my arm. I froze, unable to move, my breath hitching in my throat. I could feel the cold of its touch, something impossibly dry and lifeless. "I told you." "Stay," the voice whispered again, right next to my ear this time. The air seemed to vibrate around me, thick and suffocating. Tears stung my eyes as I fought the rising panic. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. The grip tightened, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Don't leave," the voice continued, quieter this time, almost desperate. "You can't." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the grip released. I staggered back, my heart pounding, and ran as fast as I could toward the distant glow of the city. I haven't been back to that park since. And every night when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers, soft and haunting, reminding me that whatever was there is still waiting. I was driving home late after finishing a long day at the plant. The road was empty, winding through hills and fields that stretched on for miles. It was one of those stretches where there's nothing but darkness, just you and the headlights cutting through the night. I preferred it that way. No distractions, no noise, just the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. It had been a rough shift. The plant was always loud, always hot, but tonight felt different. A strange feeling had been hanging over me all day, a low, persistent unease that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the strange, flickering shadows that danced on the walls of the machinery room and the echoing creaks I heard whenever I moved too far away from the others. I tried not to let it get to me, but something wasn't right. The radio crackled again and I turned it down, the silence of the night settling in once more. As I drove, I noticed how still everything was. Even the usual hum of insects seemed to have disappeared. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is waiting just beyond the edge of your vision. I passed through a stretch of trees, their branches hanging low, creating dark tunnels over the road. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The mirror reflected only my car and the empty road behind me. As I came around a bend, the headlights caught something strange ahead. It wasn't a roadblock or an animal. It was a figure, standing motionless by the side of the road, wearing a long coat that blended into the night. My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't recognize the figure, and the fact that it was just standing there, perfectly still, made my stomach churn. I slowed down, my mind racing. Who would be out here at this hour? The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as my headlights illuminated it. I couldn't see any facial features, just a vague, shadowy form beneath the coat. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I couldn't bring myself to stop, but I slowed down, creeping past the figure. It never moved, never flinched as I passed by. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my pulse throbbed in my ears. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the figure remained still. A mile down the road, I dared to look back again. The figure was gone. I didn't stop driving until I hit the city limits. The whole ride home, I kept replaying what I'd seen. It didn't make sense. Who, or what, stood there, unmoving in the middle of nowhere? When I finally got home, I locked the door and turned on every light in the house, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been watching me, waiting for me to pass. I never went back to that road again. I don't think I ever will. I've always loved taking long drives at night. There's something about the stillness of the road, the faint hum of the tires, and the endless expanse of darkness stretching out before you. It was during one of these late-night drives that everything changed. It was a crisp autumn night. The stars were scattered like dust across the sky, and the full moon cast a pale glow over the countryside. I wasn't in a rush, just taking a leisurely drive, letting the quiet wash over me. The road was empty, barely any cars, just me and the road stretching endlessly ahead. I hadn't realized how far I'd driven until I started feeling that odd sense of isolation, the way everything seems to go silent as you leave civilization behind. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a stretch of road that felt like it went on forever. I was tempted to turn back, but something about the quiet was comforting. That's when I saw it. It was a figure standing by the side of the road. Just standing there, perfectly still. My first thought was that they were waiting for a ride, maybe a hitchhiker. But there was something off about them. They were too still, too rigid. I slowed down, trying to get a better look, but the closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. Their face was obscured, hidden in shadow. They were wearing a tattered jacket, with their hands stuffed into the pockets. I couldn't make out much more. I debated whether to stop, whether to offer help. But there was something so unsettling about the figure that I couldn't bring myself to stop. I drove past, my heart thudding harder as I forced myself to look away. But as I continued down the road, I realized that no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The unease had followed me, clinging to my every thought. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but empty road. But what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The figure was still there, only now they were walking down the middle of the road, head turned in my direction. They moved slowly, like they were gliding instead of walking. I couldn't make out their face, but their silhouette was etched into my memory. Tall, thin, and completely still. Panic began to set in. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, the sound of the tires squealing in my ears. The figure kept pace, never speeding up, never breaking stride. It was as though they weren't even affected by the car speeding past them. It was like they didn't care. I don't know how much time passed. The only sound was the roar of my engine and the relentless ticking of my heartbeat. The figure didn't vanish, didn't change. They were just there, walking as though they were tethered to the road itself. I pulled over after what felt like an eternity, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The silence outside was deafening. I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror again. The road was empty. No figure, no trace of anyone. But as I sat there, frozen in place, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching me, waiting. To this day, I wonder if I ever really escaped them, or if they were waiting for me the next time I drove through the night. The night it happened, I was driving home from a late shift. I always took the same winding route through the countryside, cutting through deserted backroads that few ever traveled after dark. There's something unsettling about these roads. No streetlights, no signs of life, just miles of empty fields and trees on either side. It's the kind of place that always feels like it's hiding something. That night, the air was unusually cold, even for late October. The moon was almost full, casting a dim, eerie glow over everything. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant sounds of animals, just the low hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt. I wasn't in a hurry to get home, so I kept my speed steady, the familiar stretch of road ahead seemingly endless. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was someone waiting for a ride, but there was something off about it. How still it was. How unnatural. I slowed down as I approached. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was just standing there, its back to me. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't human. Its form was too tall, too thin, like it didn't belong in this world. My heart began to race as I drove past, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still there. But it wasn't. I told myself I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it again, this time, closer. The same figure was standing at the edge of a field, facing me directly. Its silhouette was more distinct now, and I could make out its long, slender arms hanging limp at its sides. I wanted to turn around, to speed back the way I came, but something kept me driving forward. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel tighter, my breathing shallow. The figure stayed motionless, not moving even as I passed. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the trees thinned out that I realized the figure had somehow crossed the road ahead of me. It was standing there, halfway between where I'd last seen it and my location. Panic surged through me. I had no idea what this thing was or how it kept appearing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding past it without looking back. But every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. When I finally reached the outskirts of the town, the figure was gone. I drove the rest of the way home, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure had felt wrong. Too wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen, convinced that whatever it wasn't something human. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. And I knew. I knew it wasn't done with me. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple. Take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by a clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful, There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now, too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. I didn't believe in anything strange, spirits, haunted places, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. That is, until the night we went camping deep in the forest. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend away from everything, but what we encountered still haunts me. We found a spot off the beaten trail, miles from the nearest campground. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. It felt peaceful, remote, and untouched by the outside world. We set up camp beneath towering pines, built a fire, and shared stories late into the night. It wasn't until we fell silent that I realized something was off. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the gentle hum of the breeze, had stopped. Completely. The night felt unnervingly still. Even my friends, usually loud and talkative, grew quiet, as though we were all waiting for something we couldn't name. Around midnight, the wind returned, but it was no longer gentle. It howled through the trees with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. The fire flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the forest floor. I shifted uneasily in my seat, glancing around. The shadows seemed to twist and move in ways they shouldn't. That's when we heard it, the sound of someone walking through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't match the sound of any animal I knew. It wasn't the crunch of leaves or the soft padding of paws. It was something heavier, more human, but not quite right. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered. We all nodded, our nerves taut. I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. "Maybe it's an animal," I offered weakly, though none of us truly believed it. The footsteps grew louder, circling our camp. They came from all directions, and it didn't take long to realize whoever, or whatever, was moving wasn't trying to hide. They wanted us to hear. I stood up, heart racing. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but my legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. My friends followed my gaze as we watched shadows creep closer through the underbrush. Then it happened. From the trees, something emerged. Something that wasn't human, but not quite a creature either. It was tall, far too tall for any person, with limbs that bent unnaturally and skin that seemed to ripple like water. Its face was smooth, almost featureless, except for two black, hollow eyes that gleamed in the firelight. "Run," someone whispered, and we all turned to flee. But the figure didn't move like we did. It glided silently through the trees, faster than we could ever hope to outrun it. We could hear it, feel its presence as though it was right behind us, always just a step away. We made it back to the car, slammed the doors shut, locked them, and peeled away from the woods as fast as we could. None of us spoke. We couldn't. The image of that thing, its endless eyes watching us from the shadows, was burned into my mind. Even now, years later, I can still feel its gaze. I don't know what it was, or why it followed us. All I know is that sometimes, some places leave scars deeper than memory. The old barn was far from where I had ever expected to encounter anything remotely eerie. I grew up on a farm, and barns were part of life, places for animals, equipment, and nothing more. But that summer evening changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple task: check on the horses and ensure everything was secure before nightfall. My family had always kept the barn in good shape, but this one had been abandoned for years, unused since my grandfather had passed. Most of the time, we avoided going near it. Something about the way it loomed in the distance always made my skin crawl. I remember walking across the overgrown fields, the tall grass brushing against my legs as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the landscape. The barn sat a few hundred feet away, its wooden frame creaking slightly in the breeze. I had to see if the horses were okay, even though I didn't like the way the air felt around it. The moment I stepped inside, the silence was overwhelming. Dust floated in the slanting light that seeped through a broken roof panel. It was strange. Everything was as I remembered. But there was something else, a smell, musty and old, but beneath that, something faintly metallic. I couldn't place it. As I moved deeper into the barn, the air grew colder, biting at my skin. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally. The faint noise of hooves clattering against the wooden floor, like they were dancing, tapping in a pattern I couldn't quite make sense of. It didn't belong to the horses. I stopped. My breath misted in the stillness as I strained to listen. The clattering continued, but now it seemed further away, like something was moving deeper into the barn. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but the shadows appeared to shift, bending in ways they shouldn't have. They seemed alive, writhing like dark tendrils, stretching longer than they should in the dim light. Something was watching. I called out to the horses, but the silence swallowed my voice. There was no response, only the distant clattering sound that was now getting closer. I could feel the cold radiating off the wooden beams, seeping into my bones. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the barn, barely illuminated by the fading light, a figure stood motionless. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was twisted, distorted, and though its face was obscured, I could feel the weight of its gaze. The shadows surrounding it seemed to pulse, shifting like a living thing, as if the figure controlled them. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey as I stared at it. The clattering had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that felt as though it was waiting for something. A chill ran through me, colder than the night air. Then the figure began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately. The floor groaned under its steps, as if the very wood resisted its presence. Its form twisted again, contorting unnaturally. The shadows seemed to cling to it, as though they were a part of it, not separate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt frozen. The figure stopped just a few feet away, the silence stretching between us. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, but there was no sound. Suddenly, it raised a hand, not to harm, but in a slow, deliberate motion, as if asking for something I couldn't give. The shadows extended toward me, and for a moment, I thought they might consume me. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the deeper shadows of the barn. I stood there, trembling, until the cold became unbearable. My legs finally moved, carrying me out of the barn, back into the open field. I didn't look back. The barn stood silent, as though nothing had ever disturbed its stillness. But something had. I never thought a simple trip to the library could go so wrong. But that's exactly what happened. It was a quiet Thursday evening, and I'd gone to return a book I had borrowed earlier in the week. The library was one of those old, sprawling buildings with creaky wooden floors and shelves that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The place had always felt peaceful during the day, but at night, it transformed into something entirely different. I arrived around 8 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set. The place was empty except for the dim lights glowing faintly from the ceiling. I preferred it like that. No distractions, just the quiet rustling of pages and the creak of old furniture. I found a book I had meant to return and walked toward the front desk. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The door behind the counter, usually locked, was slightly ajar. I paused, unsure. No one had ever left that door open before. It wasn't a staff door either, more of a storage room or maintenance access. I took a step closer and pushed it open just enough to glance inside. It was empty, or so I thought. But there was a smell, something old and musty, like forgotten history. I chalked it up to the building's age and moved on, returning the book. As I walked through the aisles, I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the shelves, amplifying the silence. I half expected to hear the distant shuffle of someone else's steps, but there was nothing but my own. It wasn't until I came to the farthest corner of the library that things took a turn. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. My skin crawled, but I told myself it was just the building settling. I'd always liked old libraries, but now something felt off. I continued down the row, heading toward the fiction section, when I saw it. A figure, just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the dim light. It stood still, as if waiting for me. I froze, heart pounding, but something told me to look away. So, I did. It wasn't until I had taken a few more steps that I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The aisle behind me was empty. I stood there, frozen, my eyes darting between the rows of books. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then I heard it again, this time, closer. I could feel someone behind me, even though I couldn't see them. My chest tightened and my breath quickened. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the space behind me. Then, a voice, low and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the shelves. "Who's there?" My stomach dropped. I didn't dare answer. The voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't human either. It was patient, waiting. I felt like something was drawing closer, closer, closer. A sudden crash from deeper inside the library made me jump. I didn't think, just ran. I sprinted toward the entrance, my mind screaming for me to get out. I didn't dare look back. The air seemed thicker as I pushed the front door open, fleeing into the cool night. I didn't stop running until I was home, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that library. To this day, I haven't gone back. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with the grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, the creaking of footsteps, slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. I've always loved the city at night. The neon lights, the quiet hum of cars far off in the distance. There's something peaceful about it. I never thought much of urban legends or ghost stories. They always felt too far-fetched for someone like me, someone who preferred logic and reason. But one night, everything changed. It was a routine evening walk through the city, something I'd done countless times before. I left my apartment, heading toward the park that bordered the edge of downtown. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional footsteps echoing beneath the towering skyscrapers. I didn't mind the quiet. It felt peaceful, a rare escape from the buzz of the day. As I walked, I passed by a small, dimly lit convenience store, its fluorescent lights flickering like a heartbeat. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the trash to skitter across the pavement. The park was just a block away, so I decided to cut through and take the shortcut. The park was eerily quiet, even for the middle of the night. The usual sounds of the city seemed to vanish. No distant traffic, no voices from the few people that might wander through. It was as though the park had been consumed by some invisible void. I took another step and realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. The sensation prickled at the back of my neck and my pulse quickened. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of trees looming over the pathway. Probably just my nerves, I muttered to myself. I took a deep breath and started walking again, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The quiet became oppressive, the kind that weighs down your chest and makes you question if you're really alone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of something trailing behind me in the dark. Every step I took felt heavier, more deliberate, as though something, or someone, was watching from the shadows, waiting. I reached a clearing near the center of the park where an old, rusted bench sat under a single street lamp that flickered intermittently. I hesitated, looking around, but still saw no sign of anyone. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, blending into the darkness, watching. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, carried by the wind. Not words, just a low, indistinct murmur, as if the air itself was speaking. My heart pounded harder. I instinctively stepped back, my breath quick and shallow. I wasn't alone. Something moved in the shadows, shifting just beyond the reach of the street lamp's light. I froze, eyes wide, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing, just darkness and the faint sound of rustling leaves. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I started walking faster now, trying to shake the overwhelming feeling of dread. But the whisper followed me, growing louder, more persistent. My mind raced, wondering if I'd somehow stumbled into some bizarre dream or hallucination. I kept expecting to turn a corner and see someone, or something, standing there, watching me from the darkness. But nothing came. As I neared the edge of the park, I felt something brush against my leg. I jerked back, heart pounding. There was nothing there. The whisper had grown into a chorus of faint voices, overlapping and unintelligible as though a crowd of whispers was surrounding me, closing in. Panic set in. I broke into a sprint, sprinting as fast as I could out of the park, back toward the street where my apartment was. My breath came in short, ragged gasps and my legs burned, but I didn't stop. When I reached the edge of the park, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my apartment, doors bolted, lights on. The next morning, I told myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination, maybe caused by stress or exhaustion. But I can't forget the feeling of being followed, of those whispers in the dark, of something just beyond my sight. To this day, I still wonder if I was truly alone that night, or if something not human, was watching me, waiting. My friends and I had been planning hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps. Quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The park had been closed for decades, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by everyone. The faded, crumbling entrance sign seemed to scream out to us, promising something eerie and unknown. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. We wandered down the cracked paths, past the rusting remnants of broken rides. The Ferris wheel stood towering, skeletal, and empty. Everything felt frozen in time, silent, lifeless, and oddly oppressive. No laughter or music from forgotten years echoed through the park, only the distant creak of old metal and the occasional rustling of leaves. We kept moving deeper into the park, unsure of what we were hoping to find. It wasn't the typical thrill of the unknown. It felt darker. As we approached the old carousel, I noticed something odd. The wooden horses weren't just decaying. They seemed to have faces carved into them. Hollow eyes, twisted grins. I instinctively stepped back, my pulse quickening. "What the hell is this?" someone whispered. We tried to laugh it off, but the unease was settling in too deeply. There were too many strange details, small things we couldn't ignore. The once bright colors of the rides had faded into drab, muted hues, and the air felt dense, as though it was pressing in on us. At one point, we came across an old photo booth. It was the only thing still relatively intact. The curtain was tattered, flapping in the wind, and the once vivid pictures printed from the machine were scattered across the floor. I bent down to pick one up, an image of a family smiling, frozen in time. But something wasn't right. The smiles were crooked, their eyes staring past the camera as if they were looking at something we couldn't see. Something about that photo sent a chill down my spine. I looked up, expecting to see my friends, but they had wandered off, further into the park. I hesitated for a moment before following them, clutching the photograph tightly. The deeper we went, the more things began to feel off. The sounds we had heard earlier, the creaking, the wind, began to shift into something unnatural. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves anymore, it was the faint, distant sound of laughter, but it wasn't coming from us. The laughter seemed to come from the depths of the park, distorted and hollow, echoing in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It felt like it was all around us, but we couldn't see a source. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us dared to speak. We eventually found ourselves near the old roller coaster, once grand, now rotted and skeletal. The metal rails were twisted, dangling in midair like broken teeth. Below it, there was an old wooden bench covered in mold. A single flicker of something caught my eye, a small faded envelope resting on the bench. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and picked it up. It was sealed shut, but the paper was worn and fragile. I opened it carefully, revealing a single faded photograph inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same photo booth picture I had found earlier, a family frozen in time, but this one was different. The figures were closer, and their eyes weren't lifeless anymore. They were watching me, staring directly at me. Through the picture, as if they knew I had it, I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I glanced up, heart racing, and realized the laughter had stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Suddenly, my friends were screaming from deeper within the park. "Run!" someone shouted. "Get out of here!" I didn't think twice. I shoved the photo back into the envelope and bolted, my legs pumping as the distant cries of my friends echoed in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance of the park. The moment I stepped onto the pavement, the air seemed lighter, but my heart was still pounding. I didn't dare look back. That night, back home, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The photo was still clutched tightly in my hand, the faces of the family still watching. I haven't been able to bring myself to throw it away. Whatever was out there in that park, whatever was left behind, it's still following me. I can feel it. And every night, I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. It was late spring when I decided to take a trip to the old lighthouse. Located on a rocky outcrop overlooking the coast, it wasn't a place people visited often. Most locals whispered about how the lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and doors rusted shut. Despite the warnings, I always had a fascination with places like this, forgotten, isolated, and steeped in mystery. I parked my car at the edge of the cliff and climbed over the low fence that marked the entrance. The air was salty and thick with the smell of the ocean. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its worn brick exterior covered in moss. It was both haunting and beautiful in the fading light. I pushed open the creaking metal door at the base of the structure and stepped inside. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, so I pulled out a flashlight from my backpack. The beam flickered, casting shaky light against the old stone walls as I made my way up. Each step echoed around me, amplifying the silence. It felt as though the place had been waiting for me, abandoned and forgotten. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the air became, growing colder with each passing floor. By the time I reached the top, I was surrounded by the familiar smell of dust and decay. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out before me, waves crashing against the cliffs below. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude, the silence. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the vastness of it all. But then I noticed something strange. In the distance, along the jagged coastline, there was movement. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I watched, it became clearer. A figure silhouetted against the horizon. They were standing there, unmoving, watching. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out who or what they were, but there was something unnerving about the way they seemed to hold perfectly still. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I had read too many old ghost stories about this lighthouse after all. I turned back to the view, trying to distract myself, when I heard it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear what was being said. The words were too soft, too distant, and yet they felt closer than they should have been. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I shined it into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, growing louder. Panic began to set in. I had never believed in ghosts, but now, alone atop this desolate lighthouse, I wasn't so sure. The figure from earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It felt like something was breathing down my neck. I began to make my way back down the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my grip. With each creak of the old wood, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down harder. The whispers didn't stop, but now they seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. By the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The door I had entered through loomed ahead, the only way out. I tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. I yanked at it, heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I realized something had locked me inside. Panic surged through me. I spun around trying to find another way out, but the only way was up. The whispers had grown into screams now, echoing through the narrow corridors, but there was no one there. I stumbled back toward the staircase, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a lifeline. I kept climbing, each step feeling heavier, each echo more deafening. It was only when I reached the top that I saw them again, the figure from earlier. They were inside now, standing at the base of the staircase, staring up at me. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. There was no escape. I didn't scream. I didn't move. All I could do was watch as they began to ascend, their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. I had always loved driving. Long road trips, winding highways, and the sense of freedom they brought. That's why I decided to take an impromptu trip one evening, just to escape the noise of the city. No destination in mind. Just me, my car, and an open road stretching ahead. It was around 10 p.m. when I hit the road. The air was crisp and the moon hung low in the sky, casting its silver glow on the empty highways. I didn't mind the quiet. The roads were deserted, and aside from the occasional passing car, I felt like I had the world to myself. Hours passed, and I found myself driving through farmland. The fields stretched on for miles, with barns and old wooden fences lining the road. I kept going, entranced by the solitude and the sound of the tires humming on the pavement. There wasn't a soul in sight. As I rounded a bend, I noticed something strange. Off in the distance, a figure walking along the side of the road. At first, I thought it was someone out for a late-night stroll. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't quite human. The figure moved in a way that didn't make sense. Its steps were slow, almost unnatural, like it was gliding rather than walking. It wore a tattered coat that seemed too large for its frame, trailing behind like something out of a dream. The closer I got, the more I felt that something wasn't right. I slowed the car, unsure what to do. The figure turned its head slowly, almost mechanically, and locked eyes with me. There was no expression on its face, just hollow, empty blackness where eyes should have been. Panic shot through me. I didn't know whether to stop or speed away, but something kept me glued to my seat, unable to look away. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind I was used to. It was as though I was being drawn in, compelled to stay and witness whatever this was. As I drove past, the figure continued its slow, unnatural pace. I turned to glance in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind me. But there it was again, staring at me, still moving forward. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, as if whatever that thing was still out there, trailing me through the night. Minutes passed in silence, but the weight of the encounter lingered. I drove faster, trying to outrun whatever had followed me. My heart pounded in my chest, each mile marker flashing by like a countdown. Eventually, I found a small gas station tucked away in the middle of nowhere. I pulled in, trying to catch my breath. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt oppressive. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing. I went inside, bought a bottle of water, and forced myself to sit on one of the benches outside. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it had been a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew better. Just as I was about to get back in my car, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned, expecting nothing. But there it was again, standing at the edge of the gas station, staring at me with those hollow black eyes. It didn't move closer, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. I sat frozen, my breath hitching. The air grew colder, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, in a whisper that seemed to come from inside my own mind, I heard it again. You can't escape. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, leaving the figure behind. The road stretched out ahead of me, endless and dark, but no matter how fast I drove, I knew I couldn't outrun whatever had been following me. It was still there, waiting in the shadows. It was late summer, and I decided to take a day off to explore the old abandoned amusement park. No one had been there in years, and the place had become a local legend. I remember hearing whispers about it being haunted. but I always dismissed those tales as just folklore. The park sat just a few miles from town, hidden between the trees, its entrance overgrown with weeds and ivy. When I arrived, the sight of rusting roller coasters and decayed ticket booths sent a chill through me. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to dull grays and greens. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breathing feel too loud. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I began exploring, walking through the empty park, my footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. There was a sense of emptiness so profound, it felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the park had been waiting for someone like me to come back. The longer I wandered, the more unsettling it became. The rides loomed above, their rusted tracks creaking softly in the wind. I passed the old Ferris wheel, its once bright lights now dull and flickering weakly. The carousel had lost its once lively tunes, now reduced to the faintest of echoes. I decided to check out the haunted house ride, the most infamous attraction. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Dark Carnival." I hesitated, standing at the entrance, my heart thudding in my chest. The thought of venturing inside made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside. The first few steps felt normal enough, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I could hear distant whispers, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I came to a part of the ride where mirrors used to reflect the illusion of endless hallways. But, instead of reflections, I saw something far more disturbing. Shadows that stretched and writhed as if they were alive. My breath hitched, and I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. The further I explored, the more the whispers became distinct. They weren't voices, but something far more sinister. Low, echoing murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The walls around me seemed to pulse faintly, as if the place itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward and fell, landing hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw something on the floor. A black handprint, impossibly large, as if made by something inhuman. My stomach twisted as I realized the prints led deeper into the maze of the haunted house. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The shadows felt closer now, watching, waiting. I pressed on, hearing the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was there was feeding off my fear. Finally, I emerged from the dark maze and found myself back in the open air, beneath the pale light of the moon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I glanced back toward the entrance of the haunted house. The whispers were now louder, as if they were surrounding me. Then I saw it. A figure, standing motionless by the entrance, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the exit, every step feeling like it might be my last. The figure didn't follow, but I could still hear the whispers in my ears, clearer than ever. The next morning, I drove past the park on my way home. The place seemed just as desolate as before, but something felt different. The whispers still echoed in my head, and I swear I could hear them even now, as if whatever I encountered had found a way into my mind, and I could never escape it. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind, but the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. "Look." I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low, as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. "Come. Closer." The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. It was just a normal weekend at my family's cabin by the lake. No guests, no visitors, just me, my brother, and our parents. We'd been coming here for years, so the routine was always the same. Lazy days by the water, campfires and card games, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what I thought. The first day was peaceful. We set up by the dock, swam in the cool water, and ate dinner under the stars. By nightfall, the only sounds were the distant call of loons and the crackling fire. But as I lay in the small tent we'd pitched, something didn't feel right. The woods were always quiet at night, but that night they seemed too quiet. At first, I told myself it was just the usual overactive imagination that kicked in when you were isolated like this. But something felt off, like I wasn't alone. I sat up, straining to hear anything. The usual sounds of wildlife had vanished. The wind wasn't moving through the trees. It was too still. I finally gave up trying to sleep and unzipped the tent to step outside. The full moon lit up the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I glanced around, but there was nothing out of place. My brother's tent was still standing a few feet away, and my parents' cabin was just visible beyond the trees. The whole property was dark and peaceful, as it should have been, but as I stood there, listening to the silence, I saw something. A shadow, not quite human, not quite anything else, moving through the trees. It wasn't an animal, at least nothing I recognized. It was too tall, too thin, and moving unnaturally slow. I froze, heart pounding. The figure didn't seem to notice me. It just continued to drift deeper into the forest, blending with the darkness. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. I stared until it was gone, swallowed by the woods. When I finally returned to the tent, I told myself it had to be my imagination. There was no way something real could have been out there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak of the cabin, every shifting branch outside, making my pulse spike. The next morning, my brother woke up and greeted me as usual. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked hesitantly. He frowned, scratching his head. "Now that you mention it, yeah. I thought I heard something, but I didn't want to wake you up. It was like footsteps, right?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Footsteps?" "Yeah," he said. "They weren't from us. Sounded like something walking through the woods, slow and dragging. Like someone was lost out there." We stared at each other, our shared unease growing. We checked around the cabin, searched the property, but there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone passing through. It was just us, surrounded by silence once again. That night, we kept the fire burning and stayed close. The woods felt darker, emptier. The cabin, once familiar and safe, now seemed distant and unreachable. Every sound, a branch cracking, a distant rustle, sent chills down my spine. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to check again. I left the tent, walking to the edge of the trees where the shadows seemed thickest. This time, I saw it. A pale figure, even taller than before, standing just beyond the tree line. Its eyes were dark, hollow, and it tilted its head slowly as if it could feel my gaze. I held my breath, unable to look away. It took a slow step toward me, and I realized with a jolt, it wasn't walking like a person. Its legs were bent at impossible angles as though its bones didn't move naturally. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. I watched as it drifted closer, and then, without warning, it vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My brother and I stayed close, checking each other's sanity, waiting for the dawn. When the sun rose, we packed up and left. To this day, I still wonder what we saw. I've tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal, maybe my imagination. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Whatever it was watching us, waiting, and I'm not sure if it ever really left. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed, a break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold, a trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp, toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail, the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, no memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows. It was an early spring day, and I was driving alone on a remote country road. The landscape stretched out around me, fields of tall, golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. The road twisted and turned through empty stretches of land, the occasional farmhouse appearing in the distance before disappearing again. I wasn't in any rush. It had been a long week, and I figured a quiet drive was just what I needed to clear my head. My car's engine hummed softly, and the only sounds were the tires on the road and the occasional chirping of birds. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, another farmhouse far off in the distance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a farmhouse at all. It was an old, wooden structure, half buried in weeds and overgrown trees. The roof was caved in, windows shattered, and the whole thing seemed to lean at a strange angle, like it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. The building didn't look like it had been lived in for a long, long time, but there was something unsettling about its quiet, abandoned state. I figured it must have been some sort of barn at one point, but now it was just a hollow shell of what it used to be. I parked the car a few hundred feet away and stepped out, the dry earth crunching underfoot. The wind stirred the trees, making them creak softly. I approached the old structure cautiously, my footsteps slowing as I took in the eerie silence. When I got to the door, I pushed it open gently. Dust and cobwebs hung in the air, and the stench of decay was thick. It smelled like something had died in there and never been removed. My flashlight flickered to life, casting long shadows across the interior. Inside, the place was a mess, rotting beams, broken furniture, and scattered debris. But what caught my attention was something on the far wall, something I hadn't noticed until I moved deeper into the barn. It was a photograph, nailed crookedly to the wood. The image was yellowed with age, almost too faded to make out, but I could tell it depicted a family, 2 parents and 3 children, standing in front of the barn with smiles frozen on their faces. My stomach twisted. I hadn't expected to find anything like this. The faces in the photograph looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. I glanced around the room, running my flashlight beam over the clutter. That's when I noticed more photos, dozens of them. Old family portraits, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, all of them nailed to the walls. The people in the photos seemed to watch me, their smiles distorted, eyes fixed on something just beyond the frame. The air grew colder, and I felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on me. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I tore my eyes away from the photographs. My light flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, soft, almost inaudible, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, like a breath in my ear. My heart pounded as I slowly turned back to the photos. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The people in the photographs weren't just staring at me. They were moving. Ever so slightly, their faces contorted, their expressions shifting from smiles to something darker. The eyes that had once looked joyful now seemed hollow, empty, as if they were gazing at something beyond the frame. The shadows in the room deepened, and I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were moving, like they were stepping out from the photographs. Panic surged through me as I bolted for the door. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, flickering shadows across the doorway. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me from all sides, their faint murmurs growing into distorted echoes. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, heart racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. As I sped away down the empty road, I could still feel those hollow eyes staring at me from inside the barn. I don't know who or what they were, or why they were trapped in those photos, but I'm sure of one thing. They're still there, waiting. It was a quiet night at the old cinema. I was the only one working, the projectionist. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The theater itself was a relic, built decades ago with worn-out seats and a projector that creaked like an old ship. The movies were rarely popular anymore, but the few people who still came were loyal, regulars who didn't seem to mind the dust and the dim lighting. I liked the quiet, the solitude, but tonight something felt off. The last showing had ended hours ago, and now I was in the projection room, staring at the faint glow of the reel spinning. I was about to shut down the projector when I heard it, the faintest noise. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, coming from the hall below. I froze, listening. The theater had been empty for hours, or at least I thought it had. The whisper wasn't just in my head, it was real, distinct. It came again, a voice barely above a breath. "Help." I leaned closer to the edge of the projection room, peering down into the darkness. The hall was still. Nothing. My heart raced as I hesitated, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help. Please." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it wasn't from the films either. It wasn't part of the stories on screen. My breath caught in my throat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I descended the stairs slowly, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers continued, now more distinct. "I'm here. Please." I reached the main floor of the theater. The screen flickered faintly, casting long shadows in the dim light. The chairs were empty, just as they had been when the last film ended. Yet, the whispers came from the seats, as if someone, something, was sitting there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the voice. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. The whispers became clearer, more desperate. I can't get out." I turned my head, scanning the rows of seats, but saw no one. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. They were coming from beneath one of the seats. Trembling, I knelt down and lifted the seat. Beneath it, there was nothing, only the cold, bare floor. But the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears as if they had no source at all. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot. The whispers didn't stop. "Help. Please." Then suddenly there was silence, complete and oppressive. My heart was hammering, and I clutched my chest, wondering if I'd imagined it all. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a figure on the far side of the theater, barely illuminated by the screen. It was a shape, taller than a person, its form blending with the shadows. No face, just an empty void where eyes should be. Before I could react, the figure moved closer, drifting silently across the room. It didn't walk. It glided, like smoke being pulled through the air. My breath caught again, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold. I turned, only to find an empty row of seats behind me. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was still empty. The screen blinked, casting distorted reflections of the room onto itself, but the whispers had stopped. I didn't stay long after that. I locked up and left, never looking back. I never heard those whispers again. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. I remember the day clearly. It wasn't anything special, just a regular evening in an old, crumbling city. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world had paused. I was walking home from the library after a long day of studying. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the cracked pavement. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and I decided to take a shortcut through an alley. The air was thick with a strange metallic smell, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. I reached the mouth of the alley when I heard a soft, uneven scraping sound behind me. I froze. My breath caught, and I turned slowly, expecting to see someone, maybe a homeless person or a cat. But there was nothing. The alley stretched behind me, empty and dark. My heart pounded as I took a cautious step backward, keeping my eyes on the shadows. I scanned the space again, hoping to find some rational explanation for the noise. There was nothing. I continued walking, but the unease lingered. The scraping sound echoed in my mind, growing louder with every step. I glanced back one last time and saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the alley, obscured by the dim light. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I felt its presence in my bones. My legs felt frozen, like I couldn't move. The figure remained still, watching, as though it was waiting for me. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw another shadow, just to my left. This one was closer, much closer. I could feel its cold breath on my neck as I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Panic set in. I started running, my footsteps echoing through the alley, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every turn I took, there was always something watching, always a presence just out of reach. Eventually, I found myself at the end of the alley, my chest heaving, breath coming in ragged gasps. The streets stretched out before me, quiet as ever. I didn't know how long I'd been running, but the silence was worse than the fear. It wasn't until I turned to leave the alley that I saw them again. 3 figures, standing perfectly still, watching me from across the street. Their faces were hidden, shadows consuming them, but I could feel their gaze as if they were right beside me. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I forced myself to look away and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safe inside my apartment. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. The silence of the night was broken only by my own trembling breath. I don't know what those figures were, or what they wanted. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear before, and I hope I never feel it again. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence. The absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still. The kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse, it was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea, it felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out, but the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. I was on a road trip with some friends, driving through endless flatlands that stretched out like a forgotten world. It was just us. No towns, no cell service, just miles of dry, cracked earth and endless sky. We had set out from the city, heading toward some isolated national park that none of us had ever visited before. The sun had long since set by the time we realized we were lost. The GPS had been spotty from the beginning, and now, deep in the middle of nowhere, it had completely failed us. The horizon seemed to blur into itself, and the landscape looked more like a dream than reality. No lights from towns, no signs of life, just us and the desolation. As we drove, a fog rolled in, creeping along the ground like something alive. It wasn't cold, just oppressive. The air felt thick, and the quiet was unsettling. We passed what looked like old, rusted-out vehicles, abandoned long before we ever arrived. Each one was a monument to time's relentless march through this forgotten place. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the car came to a halt. We sat there, the silence pressing in on us. No wind, no noise, just the hum of our own anxious breathing. "It's out of gas," someone said, breaking the silence. I checked the tank. It was completely empty. The moonlight barely cut through the thick fog, casting everything in an eerie, washed-out glow. We stepped out of the car, the ground dry and cracked beneath our feet. The air was thick, almost like it pressed down on my chest. I felt a cold shiver run through me, but none of us spoke of it. We set out on foot, hoping to find some sign of life, some hint of civilization. The fog thickened as we walked, swirling around us. becoming more like a presence than a natural phenomenon. My friends began to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something they didn't want to draw attention to. Hours passed in silence, or so it felt. The land seemed endless. The fog never lifted, and there was no relief from it. Eventually, we came across something that didn't fit. An old wooden structure, half buried by the earth, barely visible beneath the thick fog. We cautiously approached, hoping it might provide some shelter or a clue. As we drew closer, I noticed something else: footprints. They were small, almost childlike, leading away from the building and into the darkness. They didn't seem natural, as though someone had deliberately walked there. Inside the structure, we found what remained of a small, forgotten homestead. Rusted tools, cracked furniture, and old, faded photographs of people who were long gone. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the weight of years gone by. That's when we heard the sound, the faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized my friends had stopped moving, frozen, their eyes wide with fear. It came again, more distinct this time. A voice, barely audible, calling from outside. But it wasn't like any voice I had ever heard. It was not human. It was hollow, distant, as though it came from some place beyond this world. Follow. The voice seemed to echo, twisting through the fog. My friends were visibly shaken. We had to get out of there. We had to run. But the fog was thick, blinding us to our surroundings, and the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. We stumbled back toward the car, but it felt like we were moving in circles. The structure faded behind us, lost in the swirling mists. The voice followed us, always just beyond reach. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the car, and something inside told me we shouldn't get in. But we did. As soon as the doors shut, the fog receded slightly. We could see the road again, though it stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. The drive was long, and the silence oppressive. We didn't speak much. None of us could shake the feeling of being watched, as if the fog had followed us, waiting just out of sight. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. All I know is that something wasn't right, and I pray we never cross paths with whatever it was again. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. It was supposed to be just an ordinary day at home. The house sat on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by open fields and woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I lived alone, but I wasn't one to feel uneasy about the quiet, isolated life. At least, I wasn't until that day. The morning started off normal, just another day of cleaning, catching up on emails, and preparing for the usual chores. But something about the air felt off. It wasn't heavy or oppressive, just different. I shook it off, attributing it to the weather. Maybe the storm they'd predicted was finally rolling in. Around noon, the rain began, soft at first, but growing stronger by the hour. I watched it from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee. The sky was a thick, dull gray, and everything beyond the yard blurred under the falling sheets. I didn't think much of it until I heard the knock. It came softly at first, 3 quick raps on the front door. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. The knocking came again, a bit louder this time, persistent. But no one ever showed themselves. I told myself it was probably just someone needing shelter from the storm. Maybe a neighbor, though no one I recognized. I stood in front of the door, heart hammering, and cracked it open just a little. No one was there. I peered outside into the rain, but the porch was empty. There was no one around, just the relentless downpour and the empty, soaking fields beyond. I checked the locks and decided to ignore it. Must have been my imagination, I told myself. Storms can mess with your head. I went back to the living room, the chill of the rain beginning to seep into my bones. The windows fogged up as the rain continued to fall harder. The noise outside grew louder. the steady pitter-patter of droplets becoming a relentless pounding. It was soothing in a way, like the world was washing away everything around me. Hours passed. I lost track of time, engrossed in some half-read book, when a sudden noise made my blood run cold. A slow, scraping sound came from the back of the house, faint but deliberate, like something dragging across the floor. My stomach clenched and I sat there, frozen, waiting. The scraping grew louder. It wasn't coming from the window or the door, but from deeper inside the house. The kind of sound that made you wonder how something could even move like that. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe some loose shutter flapping against the wall, but the wind doesn't scrape like that. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. Each step felt heavier, each breath quieter. The scraping continued, rhythmic, unnerving. I reached the hallway leading to the back of the house and shined my light down the dark corridor. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over and shuffling, moving towards the kitchen. Its back was grotesquely twisted and its arms were far too long, dragging along the floor. I couldn't make out a face, just dark voids where eyes should have been, and something glistening at the corners of its mouth. Panic surged through me, but I didn't scream. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, frozen in place as the thing advanced. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing that seemed to echo through the house. Then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, I could feel its presence just a few feet away, as if it had paused, waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing through the quiet. Who's there? I managed to whisper, but my voice barely escaped. Silence. Another long minute passed, the air thick with dread. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing and the relentless rain outside. Slowly, cautiously, I backed away, retracing my steps. The figure never followed. I didn't hear it leave. But when I checked the back door, the lock was undone. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my phone tightly, waiting for dawn. The storm raged on, but whatever had been there, watching, had never come back. The night it happened, I wasn't even supposed to be there. A few friends and I decided on a spontaneous trip to an abandoned train station. It was old, long forgotten, deep in the woods, miles from civilization. The place had always held a strange allure, a remnant from a past that seemed almost mythical. The tracks were overgrown, the station itself crumbling under years of neglect. We hiked out there with flashlights, excited for the eerie adventure. The walk felt normal at first, just trees, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, and the sounds of creatures in the woods. It wasn't until we reached the station that the mood shifted. The first thing we noticed was the silence. It wasn't the typical woods silence, the kind where animals go quiet at dusk. This was deeper, as if the forest itself had gone still, like something had pressed pause on the world. Even our own voices felt muted, unnatural. We made our way inside the old building. The walls were stained with mildew, the air thick with the smell of decay. Broken benches and faded posters hung loosely from the walls. Graffiti covered most surfaces, scribbled warnings of danger and decay, but something about it felt different, wrong. We wandered further into the station, and that's when things started to feel off. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of our flashlights. We heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from inside the building, as if they were the echoes of something long gone. I looked at my friends, and we all shared uneasy glances, not sure if we were imagining it or if something truly was there with us. Then, from down the corridor, we heard it, a faint metallic clinking, like something was dragging along the floor. We froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like it was coming toward us. I signaled to my friends to stay still, but before we could even speak, the light flickered above us. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the station, and the air felt charged, like we were standing in the center of some unexplainable tension. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. The clinking grew louder, echoing off the cracked walls. It wasn't coming from one of us. Something was there. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human-like. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it appeared more as a shadow than a person. I stepped back, heart pounding. My friends had already begun to whisper frantically, but none of us could make sense of what we were seeing. The figure didn't seem fully alive. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over bones that looked too sharp, like they didn't belong. Its eyes were hollow, black as night, and it moved toward us without any sign of consciousness or intent. That's when we realized it wasn't human. Panic set in, but we didn't run. We couldn't. It was like the creature had already consumed the world around it, leaving only that suffocating silence. We turned to leave, but the door that had been open earlier was now shut. No breeze, no reason for it to have closed. The creature let out another growl, louder now, closer. We could hear its footsteps dragging along the floor as it approached. It didn't seem to care whether we ran or stayed. It didn't care if we lived or died. It wasn't moving with purpose, but with an unrelenting pull towards something. In that moment, it wasn't just fear that consumed me. It was confusion. What was this thing? What was it after? I don't know how much time passed before it stopped. The growling faded, and the dragging noise was gone. We didn't move. We didn't speak. The shadows grew darker, almost as if they were swallowing the faint glow of our flashlights. When we finally gathered the courage to look again, the station was empty. The door had opened. We walked out into the night, our breaths heavy, and we didn't look back. I've never gone back to that train station. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't think I want to. But every time I'm alone, there's always that thought. Whatever it was, it's still out there. It was a hot summer evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light, casting long shadows down the sidewalks. I lived in an old, quiet suburban neighborhood that had once been bustling, but now felt hollow and deserted. Most of the houses were dark, their windows blank and lifeless. As I walked, I noticed the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling leaves. It was unnaturally still. The only sounds were the faint echoes of my own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Halfway through my walk, I noticed something off about the house 2 doors down from mine. Its porch light was flickering, buzzing faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be on or off. The windows were dark, and there was a strange emptiness to the place, as if the house itself had been abandoned long ago. But the most unsettling part was the shape standing by the front door. A tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was just the edge of a tree or a dark outline of the house, but then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't seem human. It wasn't walking like someone lost or wandering. It moved with purpose, as if it were waiting, watching for something. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to turn and run. I wanted to shout, to call out, but something held me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, staring in my direction. I could barely make out its outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The way it stood so still, yet seemed entirely aware of my presence. Slowly, it began to move towards me, taking long, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost close enough to make out its features when suddenly, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, facing me, just a few yards away. The silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without any discernible reason, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost mechanical, like it had been recorded and played back. "You should not be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I tried to take a step backward, but my body wouldn't move. The figure began to step closer again, and I could feel my panic rising. It tilted its head again, tilting toward me as if it was studying something. Then, almost too quietly to hear, it whispered, "You should have left already." Suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. My legs moved on their own, and I bolted down the street, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't look back, not once, until I was safely back home, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The figure's words haunted me. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human, and I pray I never see it again. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions, just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach, a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore. It echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite, but no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me. Or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. I never liked going to the old library. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading, but something about that place always unsettled me. It was located deep in town, far from the bustling streets, surrounded by tall, looming trees that seemed to trap the library in perpetual dusk. That day, I had gone in looking for a quiet place to work on a research project. The main hall stretched out in front of me, filled with towering bookshelves packed with forgotten volumes. The air smelled of old paper and dust, like something had been left untouched for too long. I always felt like the library was too quiet, too still, as though the very walls were watching. I found a desk tucked into a corner near the back. The sun barely made it through the high, cracked windows, casting long, dim shadows across the worn wooden floor. I set up my laptop, opened my books, and tried to focus, but the oppressive quiet gnawed at the edges of my concentration. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. I had no real sense of time in that place. Every creak, every faint whisper of wind from outside seemed magnified in the silence. I was halfway through a particularly dry section of text when I noticed something unusual. A faint noise, barely audible at first, like someone breathing just behind me. I froze, scanning the empty library, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, sharper, like someone was just inches from my ear. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. No one. The breathy noise became a low whisper, as though someone was right there speaking into my mind. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it felt off, like the voice wasn't human. I pushed my chair back, my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. I wanted to run, but something about the stillness of the library held me in place. Then came a distinct echoing creak from the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look, but my head turned on its own. In the dim light, I saw something moving. Shadowy and indistinct, it wavered near the tallest shelf. A figure, barely formed, drifting in and out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, distorted, like it was all around me now. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like the library itself had swallowed my voice. As I watched, the figure began to shift, growing more distinct. Its features were blurred, but I could see now. Hollow eyes, a twisted, gaping mouth. It didn't move like a person. It drifted, flowing across the room, closer to me. The whispering became a scream, but in my head, not from any source I could find. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The figure didn't stop. It didn't seem to notice me. It was as if it had no awareness of anything but its own existence. It drifted toward the front of the library, toward the rows of ancient books, each step sending a shudder through the floor. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled out the door, never looking back. The library remained silent, as if it had never noticed I was gone. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to find out. But I know I'll never step foot in that library again. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I blinked, and there it was again. A figure, at the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. I'll never forget that summer afternoon when I went for a hike. I wasn't a hiker, far from it. I was out of shape, but the trails near the mountains had always called to me. The air was warm, the sun was bright, and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I decided to take a trail that led deeper into the woods, away from the main paths and the familiar sounds of civilization. At first, everything seemed perfect. The birds chirped, the trees rustled gently in the breeze, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I wasn't exactly sure where I was going, but I didn't care. It felt freeing to be away from the constant noise of phones, people, and the city. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift as I lost track of time. Then, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't sudden, more like the gradual descent into something off. The birds stopped singing, and the forest became eerily silent. The air felt heavier, thicker. The light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, almost unnatural. I noticed the shadows stretching longer than they should have, growing darker, more menacing. My stomach twisted. I stopped and looked around, unsure why I felt so uncomfortable. Everything seemed the same. Trees, rocks, the trail, but something wasn't right. My instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scanning the forest. There was no one, just the trees, endless and unchanging. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt eyes on me, watching. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail curved ahead, leading deeper into the woods, but I didn't want to go any farther. I wanted to turn back. My breath grew ragged, and with each step the sense of being followed only grew stronger. Then I heard it. The faintest whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like my name, softly spoken, carried on the wind. I froze. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The forest was still, except for the sound of my own breathing. My head was spinning, and my chest felt tight. I kept walking, but every instinct in me told me to turn around and leave. I glanced back once, and for a moment I could swear I saw something. Just a flash of movement, disappearing behind a tree. My pace quickened, and as I did, the whispers began again, louder this time. They surrounded me, coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of them sent chills down my spine. Panic gripped me. I wasn't thinking straight anymore. I ran. The trail twisted and turned, but I couldn't see the end. The woods felt endless, and the deeper I went, the darker everything became. I could barely make out the path beneath my feet. Then I heard it again. A voice, closer this time, clearer, more distinct. "Turn back," it said, but it wasn't human. It was hollow, distorted, like the echo of something long dead. "Leave this place." I stumbled, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't care about the trail anymore. Nothing mattered except getting out. My mind was screaming for answers, but I knew there weren't any. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees into a clearing. My eyes widened. There, in front of me, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its eyes were black, hollow, and empty. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with a cold, unsettling stare. I stopped, paralyzed by fear. My breath hitched and my legs felt like they would give out. But something inside me told me to run. I had to get away. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, but the forest seemed endless. Every shadow felt alive, every noise a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something that had followed me from the moment I stepped off the trail. Hours later, I made it out. I don't remember much of the journey back, only that I kept running, not knowing if I'd ever escape. To this day, I don't know what that figure was or why it followed me. The forest isn't the same to me anymore. There's a quiet, lingering fear every time I step into the woods, a reminder of that day when I became lost in a world I couldn't explain. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises, something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. "I'm still here." This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. "I'll be with you, always." I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range miles from the nearest town. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there? watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I had lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone. Dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadows stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious, it didn't feel human, it felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. I've always loved the ocean. There's something about the vastness of it that feels both calming and terrifying at the same time. It was a clear summer evening when I decided to take a solo trip to the coast, something I did occasionally when I wanted to clear my mind. The beach was nearly empty, just the way I liked it, except for a few distant figures walking along the shore. I parked my car at the edge of the cliffs and made my way down to the sand. The salty air filled my lungs, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was strangely soothing. I walked along the shore, the soft sound of my footsteps mixing with the distant roar of the ocean. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the sand. As I walked further down the beach, I noticed something unusual. There, near the water's edge, was a figure standing still. At first, I thought it was someone watching the waves, but there was something off about them. The figure wasn't moving. I approached cautiously, the soft crunch of the sand underfoot growing louder as I got closer. It wasn't until I was just a few feet away that I could see them clearly. It was a woman, standing with her back to me, her long, flowing hair trailing down her back. The waves crashed around her, but she didn't flinch. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. I took another step closer, my heart starting to race. There was something eerie about the way she stood there, motionless, as though she wasn't part of the world. Her shoulders were slack and she didn't seem to notice me. As I reached out to touch her gently, her head turned slowly, almost mechanically towards me. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and void of any life. My stomach twisted into knots as I stumbled back a few steps. "Who are you?" I asked, but she didn't speak. She simply stared at me, her expression blank. A cold breeze swept across the shore, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail from the distance. The woman remained still, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I couldn't look away, my body frozen in place. Then, without warning, she turned and started walking into the ocean. The waves swallowed her, the water rising higher, consuming her figure completely. My heart pounded as I stood there, unable to move or speak. When I finally regained my senses, there was no sign of her. The beach was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring out at the horizon, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I've never gone back to that beach since,